Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We will now have our final session of the IPS Women's Conference, which is a closing dialogue featuring Minister for Home Affairs and Minister for Law, Mr. K. Shanmugam, and Ms. He Ting-ru, Member of Parliament for Sengkang GRC, Chair of Sengkang Town Council, and the Deputy Organizing Secretary of the Workers' Party. They will share their views on what they see as key issues for gender equality progress in Singapore. The closing dialogue will be moderated by Professor Lily Kong. Professor Kong is Singapore Management University's fifth president and the first Singaporean to lead the 21-year-old university. She is also the first Singaporean woman to head a university in Singapore. Professor Kong, over to you.
Thank you very much. And a very good afternoon to everyone. Welcome back to this closing dialogue session. Thank you indeed for joining. We've had a very interesting day with 3 sessions of this IPS Women's Conference 2021. The 3 sessions have focused on different areas. The first has focused on equal work and equal pay. The second has focused on home is where the work is. And thirdly, the session just before this centered on mindsets and minefields. We're very delighted to have this afternoon 2 distinguished speakers who need no introduction. We will have an hour and a half with them, and I will very quickly say how the session will proceed, and then we will get on with it. I will begin by inviting each speaker to make some short remarks of about 10 minutes each. And if all goes according to schedule, we will have actually about an hour or slightly more for Q&A. I would like to say that Pigeonhole is already open and live, and we will take questions via that platform. You do not need to wait for the remarks by each of the speakers to be over. Please feel free to type in your questions, and you can also vote on the questions that interest you. Questions, of course, with a higher number of votes may stand a better chance of being answered by the speakers. So with that out of the way, we have with us today, as you've heard, Minister K. Shanmugam and Ms. He Ting-ru. Let me begin with Minister Shanmugam. He needs no introduction, but let me at least do the courtesy of saying that Mr. K. Shanmugam is Singapore's Minister for Home Affairs and Minister for Law. He was previously also the Minister for Foreign Affairs. As Minister for Home Affairs, he oversaw a comprehensive overhaul of the Penal Code to confer greater protection for vulnerable groups, including women and children. In September last year, he launched the Conversations on Singapore's Women Development to kickstart a national effort to understand Singaporeans' aspirations and ideas on how we can further advance our women in Singapore. He announced that there would be a comprehensive review of issues affecting women with the ultimate aim of bringing about a cultural and mindset change on values such as gender equality and respect for women. May I now invite Minister Shanmugam to address us.
Thank you, Professor Lily Kong, President of SMU, and Ms. He Ting-ru, MP for Sengkang GRC, and Mr. Jandas Devan, Director of IPS. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Very good afternoon to all of you. As you heard, 9 months ago, we started these conversations on Singapore women's development to look at how we can better deal with the issues that women, old and young, face. Since then, we have held more than 100 conversations. Several thousands of women have taken part, men too, and they've shared their views candidly. And this IPS conference is a continuation of the conversation. And I thank IPS for organizing this inaugural Women's Conference and for inviting me and the others. And it's a real privilege to be here. I'll start with this question. What is the position of women today in our society? I would say the glass is maybe 2/3 full, maybe a bit more. And that isn't enough. We need to do more. Some areas we have done very well. Take women's education. About 50% of our graduates were women in 2019. Literacy rate for women, 96.1%. If you look at the 2020 UN Human Development Report, Singapore is ranked 12th out of 162 countries for equality between men and women. And that is ahead of developed countries like the US, UK, New Zealand, Canada. But in that context, why did we start on these conversations? And having started on it, what should we focus on? Why did we start? Some of you will recall the case involving a dentistry student earlier last year and the series of voyeurism cases in our universities. And you heard Monica earlier on her own experiences. There was much discussion then on the penalties the defendants should face and the relevance of factors like, the defendant has a bright future, it was a moment of folly, and so on, and how much these should count in mitigation. And it set us thinking, the framework on how we approach these, there's got to be a more philosophical, fundamental way of thinking about these issues. The punishment for crime is important. Don't get me wrong on that. So making the penalty stiffer, creating new offenses, reviewing the sentencing framework, all of that is important, and we have done all of that. And for law enforcement agencies to take these issues very seriously. But that's the relatively easier part. But when I said philosophical approach, what I meant is we also need a mindset change beyond looking at this as a crime and punishment issue. Such acts of voyeurism, similar conduct, they have to be viewed as an affront to what we stand for and against our most deeply held beliefs. The idea of equality between men and women, boys and girls, has to be hard-coded from young and imprinted deeply into our collective consciousness. So we decided we will do a thorough review, look at related issues, structural issues affecting women, affecting their ability to achieve their full potential. And as I said earlier, we have had hundreds of conversations. Let me briefly touch on some of the issues that came up during the conversations. Now, there's many of them have been discussed in the morning too, so I'm not going to go through all of them. I just give you a sense. First, what came up repeatedly is workplace, the hurdles and issues that women face, and the impact on their career, their progress. These are often linked back to their situation at home, maternity, going on maternity leave, coming back to the job, making sure that they are treated fairly when they come back. And women often take a larger share of the household work and also caregiving, whether it's a family, children, elderly parents, parents-in-law. So there's been a fair amount of feedback for more support to fulfill both career and family aspirations, and basically just a fair and equal treatment at the workplace. And many agreed also with the need for mindset shifts across the whole of society. And if you look at those issues, other issues that came up, another illustration, women's representation on boards of public companies. If you look at the Council for Board Diversity target, it was 20% by 2020, 25% by 2025, 30% by 2030 for women's representation on boards of SGX listed companies. So far, it's 17.6% representation in the top 100 listed companies in Singapore in 2020, from 7.5% in 2014. This is on the low side. It needs to be dealt with. Another area, important area, which came up repeatedly, enhancing protection and safety of women for hurt and sexual offenses. As I indicated earlier, we have further increased the penalties for those who commit sexual offenses, hurt offenses against vulnerable victims. They face enhanced penalties. And this would include victims in intimate or close relationships, even if they are not married with the offender, girlfriends, live-in partners. We have also increased the penalties for harassment of persons in an intimate relationship with the offender and for repeated breaches of protection orders. And many of you would know there was a new protection from harassment court that was set up, and it's now come into force. The act was passed in 2019. We have created also new offenses to specifically make criminal acts like voyeurism, dissemination of intimate images without consent. These have all become more prevalent with technology. And as I said in Parliament, when you come up in mitigation and you say, oh, well, this boy has a very bright future, really serve your sentence first for the offense then go and pursue the bright future that you have. The starting point has got to be no excuses. It should never have happened. And we have to teach that to our boys and girls from school: mutual respect, equality, autonomy. So a wide range of topics have been discussed in the conversations. As I said, I haven't listed everything, just a few issues to give you a sense. And today's conference is an important platform to continue the conversation. The panelists in the earlier sessions, participants have raised important points on caregiving and work and family trade-offs, the division of domestic labor, protection from sexual crimes. I hope people with views will make their views known. This has to be a whole of nation, whole of society effort. We then intend to table a white paper that takes in the relevant ideas and table it in Parliament. So I look forward to the discussion later. Thank you.
Sorry, I should unmute first. Thank you very much indeed, Minister Shanmugam. And already the questions are coming in, so I foresee a very lively discussion. But before that, I have the honor of introducing our second speaker, Ms. He-Ting Ru, who is Member of Parliament, Sengkang GRC, and Chair of Sengkang Town Council, as you've heard earlier. She's also the Deputy Organizing Secretary of the Workers' Party. She advocates for better access to opportunities and sustainability of our systems, with a focus on gender and women's issues. She's trained and practiced as a solicitor of England and Wales with Clifford Chance in London, and is head of legal and communications at a listed multinational corporation in Singapore. I present to you Ms. He.
Good afternoon, Professor Kong, Minister Shanmugam, and to all our participants. Thank you for having me here today. 2021 has been designated as a year to celebrate SG women. Who then are these SG women? They are the women who are well respected in the office, jumping on calls after their toddlers have gone to sleep, but are told by their bosses that they will withhold their pay increment because they are about to go off on maternity leave yet again. They are the women who grin and bear it while being told by well-meaning relatives who tell them that the good men don't wait, so make sure you don't put off marriage. They are the women who make hard choices to quit their jobs to look after loved ones, but find themselves struggling to find a way back into the labor force with a job that they are able to fit around their care responsibilities. They are the women who decide having children is not for them as they pursue other goals in life, but put up with side glances and chatter about why they have made this decision. With such a wide variety of lived experiences of SG women, where do we then begin to start tackling the challenges faced by women in Singapore today, while we chart a roadmap for our continued success and progress? This year's IPS Women's Conference focuses on gender equality in Singapore with an action plan for progress. Throughout the course of today, we have heard and will continue to have discussions about matters relating to how women function in various spheres, and we all have ideas about how to deal with the challenges we face in the workplace, in the home, and in society at large. These are all important conversations to have, and we must continue to push for better progress and to empower women to cover our roles in Singapore and this world. Yet we need to go back to basics, as it strikes me that gender equality will continue to be elusive if we persist in thinking of women's issues and women's success and progress through the lens of traditional measures such as climbing the career ladder and earning power. As long as we continue to view work traditionally done by women, such as caring, running households, and looking after their families, as being inferior or merely ancillary to the real work of earning wages, true equality will be hard to obtain. Why do we say that women who have dedicated their lives to bringing up their children and caring for vulnerable family members are contributing less to our society, and that the measure of a man's worth is his ability to win bread for the family? Indeed, how do we even begin to value or quantify such invaluable labor typically carried out by women? How many mothers here have been told that going on maternity leave is going on holiday and that tai-tais have it good? I certainly have. And as a response, I'd like to offer them my rambunctious 3- and 4-year-olds for a day and ask if they don't feel more exhausted by them after a full day in the office. Both men and women must be given the chance to take on either role, or even a combination of these roles that suit their family circumstances, without feeling embarrassment or suffering a penalty. Mothers and fathers must feel equally able to take time off work, whether in the form of longer parental leave or even a few hours out of their workday, to attend to the call informing them that their child has a fever and needs to be picked up from school in the middle of the day. We must stop ourselves from viewing such caring roles and the unpaid work of ensuring the smooth running of our families and households as having lower value. Each of us, in our roles as employers, family members, and part of our society, has a role to play in ensuring that we start viewing unpaid labor as having equal value to that of paid work. Only then do we have the good and solid foundation on which to place our other building blocks of addressing gender inequality in the workplace, in our homes, and in our society. I'd like to briefly touch on two other areas too, noting that there are many other issues that do require our attention. First, how do we set up our labor force to cater to the different needs of women as we struggle to juggle many balls in the air? A shift in the way we look at this issue is required. Instead of viewing the issue as employers against female workers, I think it is to the benefit of both enterprises and employees, when jobs remain flexible and working conditions are supportive for the unique situations that female employees find themselves in. Women bring much value into the workplace. Recent research has in fact shown that women are perceived by their managers, particularly male managers, to be slightly more effective than men at every hierarchical level and in virtually every functional area of the organization, including traditional male bastions of IT, operations, and legal services. So even as we look to normalize flexible work arrangements on a structural and cultural level and legislate more shared parental leave along with a gender-neutral family care leave, we must ensure that both men and women can make the choices that work for their families without stigma. This means breaking down breadwinning norms being the preserve for males and an ideal worker culture that means men are set up to achieve in the workplace. Removing the stigma of men taking responsibility for a greater burden of running households and care work means that women are less overstretched at home and will free them physically and mentally to concentrate on their jobs, which in turn would help to close the gender pay gap. Reducing the stark binary choice that many women face, family or career, could also tackle our objectively low TFR levels when more women can balance raising children and excelling in a job. The second area which I would like to touch on is to move towards full equality by removing misogynistic attitudes and biases towards women. While we agree that there are vulnerable groups of women who do require better protection, the narrative needs to move from seeing women in general as victims or needing special help to one where we are able to equip women with the correct tools to stand up for ourselves and to have laws that enshrine our absolute right to be free from harassment and discrimination by virtue of our gender. One area where anti-discrimination legislation would be helpful is in the workplace. A recent study by SCCCI found that 4 in 10 women have encountered gender discrimination in the workplace, while only 1 in 10 men have experienced the same. In this day and age, I have still encountered flippant comments from colleagues that it's preferable to hire a male employee so they won't disappear for a few months, and that a promotion or pay increment should be withheld from an employee who's about to go on maternity leave. A standard question for female job applicants too is to ask us about our marital status, whether we intend to have children, or even whether we're in a romantic relationship. While it aims to tackle this problem, the current TAFEP system places unfair responsibility on women, and indeed survivors of workplace harassment, to seek accountability and protection. The onus is placed on victims to make a report to TAFEP when experiencing workplace harassment or discrimination. The Tripartite Advisory on Managing Workplace Harassment is another example of how the mindset and mentality is still that the individual is ultimately responsible for their own safety and well-being, and advises individuals to take charge of their personal safety, health, and well-being at the workplace, or to consider telling the harasser to stop his or her unreasonable behavior. While well-intentioned, this fails to recognize the reality of existing power dynamics or the concerns that making a report may cost one's job. These make it difficult for individuals to take steps to protect oneself or to seek accountability. A more effective solution may be to have anti-discrimination legislation to legally mandate all employers to ensure proper procedures are in place to protect their employees from workplace harassment and discrimination, bearing in mind that employers do have a duty of care to their employees to ensure safety and well-being in the workplace. Another area of concern recently has been that of sexual assault. And while strong deterrence and punishments are important, we should address the root of the problem by standing up against the objectification of women generally. We can all do our part by calling out misogynistic comments made against women, particularly if such comments touch on the appearance of women, and to make it clear that women must be respected. We need to, as a society, decide that such locker room banter is in fact harmful and degrades women and perpetuates the idea that we need not be respectful of women. Individual effort is good and important, but it is not enough. Equality has to start with education, in schools, but also in the wider public. People must understand that objectification and discrimination are fundamentally wrong, not just that they may get punished. We need to be empowered to call out discriminatory behavior and be able to address structural power imbalances. Well-meaning men speaking up as champions of women is not enough. While men should be part of the conversation for sure, we need to aim for a society that respects women for who we are and to take strides towards a society that gives us a voice to shape where we want to go from here. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. He. And both your remarks have clearly generated quite a lot of thoughts in our participants' heads because quite a number of questions have already come in and attracted a number of votes. So if I might begin, I would organize the questions that have come in the following ways. There are a set of questions about legislation. There are a set of questions about policies that might be introduced. And I will begin with legislation and direct these questions perhaps to Minister. There are questions around, online behaviors and whether or not the whether or not the law should actually do more in terms of mandating ID verification on forums like Hardware Zone, just because the anonymous sexist content still runs rampant and unchecked. And if I might link that to another question, it's similar. Somebody else has asked about online pornography and whether or not we should be taking a harder stand on it from a legal perspective. May I invite Minister to share your thoughts?
Thank you, Prof. Kong. In terms of the law, it's quite strict, and the action is taken when action is possible to be taken. You see this, I agree with you that this is a serious issue, and you've recently come across female asatizas being asked to be ranked by men on their looks, horrible things. A year or 2 years ago, we have had photographs of secondary school girls being circulated. I mean, every other day something is happening. The issue is traceability, and the issue is, how do you stop it? We have a list of sites we prohibit, pornographic content, we block it, but they mushroom and spout much faster than they can be blocked. And people can anyway go to international sites for this. I think the platforms have a significant role and responsibility to take steps, and I think government has got to work with them and do more. What the precise form ought to be, whether we should ask people to put out their identity, I think it's not easy to say, but I think a lot more can be done to stop such behavior. It is, I agree, it's a problem. I agree, it's rampant. Many of us have sisters, daughters, and what's going on is unacceptable. Governments around the world are grappling with this. We have, whenever we find them, for example, the men who were circulating the photographs of the secondary school girls, they face severe penalties. So when we can find them, we do proceed. But there is a lot more that can be done, and I think the platforms need to step up too.
Thank you, Minister. Still on the subject of legislation, I might turn to Ms. He to secure your thoughts on a different set of legislation that our participants are asking about. They're saying, perhaps we actually need some anti-discrimination laws in place, and some laws around perhaps same pay for the same job, equal pay for the same job. And I wonder what your thoughts are about anti-discrimination laws.
I think as I said earlier, I think there is room for anti-discrimination laws, especially in the workplace, because as women, we do actually get quite a lot of comments and experiences made to directed at us, where especially when it comes to maternity, this is a area where I think maybe there needs to be some more protection, or maybe not protection, but there needs to be more structures put in place to make sure that we cannot that employers cannot keep discriminating against women, because I mean, personally, and with a lot of people I know, we've actually been experienced this when we actually go into maternity leave. The employers do actually say, you are leaving for a few months. I can't justify a pay raise. I can't justify a promotion. So that's one area which I feel that a lot of mums do feel quite strongly about, and having an anti-discrimination legislation to actually mandate that employers have a structure in place to protect women. I think that's something that is long overdue, and we should seriously look into that.
Thank you. Minister, if I could extend that question, I recall reading in public documents about your views on this matter, that it's probably not as straightforward as putting in place certain anti-discrimination laws, because we could end up hurting the very people we're trying to help. Would you mind elaborating on that?
The starting point, Prof, is that we shouldn't rule out legislation, right? But we should also understand that, looking at the experience of other countries, that legislation alone is not going to solve the problem. Because you put in legislation, say, to protect a group of people. We've seen examples of the group that you're trying to protect, let's say women, not being promoted, but a variety of other reasons are given. And then you've got to try and go to court and try and prove that indeed you were discriminated against. And it often becomes not an easy exercise in the end, because it's an employer-employee workplace situation. They cite a variety of other reasons. It becomes very difficult. So that alone is not a solution, but I don't think one should rule out such legislation. I think it requires a whole of society mindset change, and with enough women in senior positions, so that you may not even need to get to that stage where everyone understands, men and women, that look, having children is important. Encouraging women to go on maternity leave is important. You don't need legislation. I mean, you need legislation to sort of form a framework, but you need people to accept it. You need people to understand it. And you need men, women in senior positions across the board to say, this is important for society, this is important for our country, this is important for our company, and we all share these values. I think we need to do that too.
So thank you, Minister. And I agree with you that, at the end of the day, if we're achieving certain outcomes because of legislation, then we haven't got our value systems in place where we want them to be. And so I'd like to follow up with a question that has come from the audience about how do we actually go about achieving cultural mindset changes that are needed in society. I think we agree and recognize that cultural changes, mindset changes are necessary. But talking about it alone does not achieve that. How do we actually go about, sort of encouraging that? And I'll address this question to both Minister as well as Ms. He in that order.
You want me to go first? Okay. That is something that I mentioned in my speech last year in September when we kicked this off, and I sort of alluded to it a bit earlier too. As I said earlier, putting in legislation, for example, on sexual offenses, making voyeurism a specific offense. It was always an offense, but we sort of charged people under other rubric, but now we have a specific offense of voyeurism and increasing penalties. That's the easier part. It can be done. But I said we need to move away from this, oh, you committed a crime, we're going to punish you. That's important, but we need to not look at that as the silver bullet by itself. What is the underlying change? What's the philosophical approach that's necessary for boys and girls to grow up respecting each other, accepting each other as equals, excuse me, saying that, I need to treat this person as a person and not objectify. That means a lot more needs to be done at homes, a lot more needs to be done in schools. MOE is looking at a very comprehensive program. It does have programs. It's looking at a very comprehensive program in schools. It came up in the conversations. It's part of, I hope it will form part of the white paper when it's published. Mindset change, it's not going to happen overnight, but it is something we need to start very early on. And we need to keep talking about it and making sure that people understand what this is. And we need to bring it across to society. It's not going to be done overnight, but education, and education not just in schools.
Indeed, a lot of public education, I think, is necessary and much needed. Perhaps I could turn to Ms. He for your thoughts on this topic.
I just would like to say that, anti-discrimination legislation really is the framework, and it's really just a signal to the rest of society where, you do actually want people to know, and I'm sure Minister will agree with me on this, that, the legislation is there to say that these are the values that we have as a society. We don't stand for objectification of women. We don't stand for all these, crass and horrible comments being made, whether about women's appearance, about, their ability to do their job, so on and so forth. But, again, I want to come back to the topic of education. I think it's really important in our schools as well, particularly the education of boys. I have 3 boys, so this is something that's quite close to my heart. I think, for example, I think in the UK, there are certain charities that do really focus on the education of to try and tackle the problem of toxic masculinity among schoolboys. I think from ages about 9 up to 14 or 15. And I think this is actually something that we can look at. A very targeted approach. Where we do actually go into our schools and just speak to our boys and try and undo some of those maybe more toxic mindsets that they might be developing at that age. So I think that's really tackling that from a very young age. But looking at a wider education in the public domain, I think it's great that we in Singapore now are approaching this magic number of 30% of female legislators. I think this is also quite an important signal to women and young girls out there that women are standing up and becoming leaders and taking greater roles in public office and in public positions, and that we should be respected for who we are rather than as people who need to be protected or mollycoddled.
Thank you for that. There are quite a number of questions that have come in on policy areas, right? Moving from legislation, use of policy. And I'll just begin with one that is quite interesting to a number of participants. And I'll read the question as follows. How can government policy help to address the problem of unpaid and invisible caregiving work that is largely undertaken by women?
Okay. Prof, I assume you're addressing that to me.
Please,
okay.
Yeah.
Now, let me put in a caveat at first. As a minister, there's cabinet collective responsibility. So I can't say we are going to do this, that, and the other until cabinet actually approves something, or discusses and approves. But I can say that one, in terms of caregiving, the starting point is we shouldn't say it's only women who do caregiving. That's the first point. Second point, we all know a lot of the caregiving is done by women, but I don't think we should go to a person and say, well, would you like to choose caregiving? It must be a matter of choice for themselves. But where they do it, you know that today some assistance is being given. And I think my colleague Shun Ling mentioned the different factors in caregiving. The individual is giving care. What is the network system? What's a caregiving network system? There needs to be a support system that as a government, as a society, we should try and put in with volunteers, with others, with agencies to come in so that the entire caregiving doesn't fall on one person alone. And how do you fit it within a framework of, say, caregiving fitted in with the medical system, the hospital system? Second, how do you take care of the mental and physical well-being of the caregiver? Third, to what extent can you recognize the contributions? You don't want to cheapen it by linking it to money, but how do you recognize in some financial way the sacrifices that such a caregiver is making? So these are all questions that are being actively looked at and considered. And I hope that they will be able to be addressed in the white paper and subsequent discussions.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to ask Ms. He an extension of that question. Earlier today, one of the speakers, Ms. Carrie Tan, talked about invisible caregiving work and suggested an idea of care fair, that parallels workfare. I don't think she had much time to elaborate on that, but perhaps, if I directed that question to you and asked your thoughts about the possibilities of actually monetizing care work in that sense. We've just heard ministers say that perhaps we shouldn't be cheapening that care work by associating money with it. But what do you think about this concept that was raised today?
I think it's obviously an interesting idea that I think everyone's looking forward to the further development of this idea of care fair and how it could actually work towards helping our caregivers. But I think one interesting thing that has come out of the pandemic really is, the really, really important role of workers who are actually employed in typically low-wage, low-status jobs of providing care for the vulnerable elements of our society, such as nurses, preschool teachers, preschool assistants. I think it hasn't escaped anyone's notice that they are the ones who are really essential when we come to the pandemic. And I think most parents now really do appreciate the work that these preschool teachers and teachers do. But typically these roles are they're quite poorly paid and they have quite a low status. So I think possibly one thing to look at is how we can actually really get people to recognize the work that they do. And then that in itself sends an important message that this is important work, and that would actually flow on to the more unpaid and informal carers that we have in society. So I think that's one way in which we can do it. And also, I think we do need to look at the retirement adequacy of these unpaid carers. For example, I'm sure all of us, legislators, MPs, we do have residents who do literally drop out of the workforce to take care of, someone, a family member with special needs, or they drop out of the workforce to look after their sister's children or their brother's children, especially if these children have special needs. A lot of these women do come to us at the end of, when they come to about 55, 60, they do come to us and say, look, I don't really have much for myself and I need some help earning or just making ends meet. So I think we really need to look into that and how we can actually support them. And I do agree that it's not always right to ascribe a monetary value to it, but practically speaking, these people do need to actually have a more sustainable ways of actually funding their retirement.
Thank you. I'm going to toggle back to Minister because there's a question that's directed to you and it extends on this theme of caregiving. And the question is, can we consider the time bank concept that was successful in Switzerland for elder care? I wonder what your thoughts about that might be.
I think this is a very important issue. As I said just now, when I said, while we don't want to cheapen it, I do think some sort of financial recognition, reasonable financial recognition for the value of the caregiving work would be a good signal, would be an important step, more than a signal. And the Swiss model is interesting. As I said, here whatever I say, I'm also speaking as a policymaker, so I need to be careful. So, Prof, what I would say to you is, we need to take caregiving seriously. I think we need to look at it again. And I know that Ministry of Health, as well as MSF, are looking at these issues. And I know that this has formed a significant part of the conversations, and we need to find a way of doing this properly for our society. I mean, I can say that much. Yeah. I accept it's a very important issue, and it needs to be dealt with.
Thank you. Fully understand that these are important and weighty issues that need to be discussed carefully before pronouncement as such. So the audience will forgive me that I will not press on with these questions of caregiving. There are various shades of questions around this theme.
I think the audience can take it that these are being given very active consideration.
Thank you. Delighted to hear that. Perhaps if I could move to another area of policy that seems to also be very interesting and important to the audience. It has to do with parental leave. And there is a set of questions around, perhaps we should have equal parental leave for fathers as much as for mothers. Again, citing the example in Europe, particularly in Scandinavia. Is there room for us to be bold on this front as an accelerator of change? And I might turn to Ms. He for your thoughts first on this issue.
I think this is definitely something which we really need to really look into. I think there was a Swedish study recently that showed that men who take more parental leave when the babies are born tend to be more involved in caring for children as they grow up, and they're more involved in families. So this again dovetails with our earlier conversation, or the earlier conversations today about how can we get better equalization between men and women in terms of child caring, household responsibilities. So I think it's really important that we look into really coming up with a shared parental leave scheme where maybe we get up to 24 weeks of shared parental leave between men and women, the father and the mother of the child. And then each family can then decide what suits them best and how to actually distribute and calibrate that between them. Because, every family is different. There are some fathers who actually desperately want to get more involved in bringing up their children. They want to get more involved when the baby is born. I think when the baby is born in the beginning, so much attention is around baby and the mum, that fathers sometimes do feel a bit left out, especially they're seen as a very female and women's world. And I think a lot of fathers do feel a bit left out, and they really want to get more involved in, just bonding with the child, because the mother has carried the child for 9 months. She's already had that bond, whereas fathers are starting from a maybe slightly more stage where, they need to play catch up a bit more. So I think giving them the flexibility to choose and to decide, I think that would be very helpful.
Thank you. So there are quite a number of other questions, so I'm not going to sort of insist that the same question is addressed by both speakers all the time. I might move on to something else, which is an interesting question to my mind, because it's not the usual policy question about parental leave or time bank and so forth. This is a question about what are the conditions that might actually create or exacerbate gender inequality. And the question is this: are single-sex schools and other single-sex institutions an obstacle to gender equality? And I turn to Minister and then Ms. He in that order.
Okay, I'm not an expert in this. I think it's best addressed to someone from Ministry of Education. But when my children were growing up, what I was told is that girls do better in girls' schools because when there are boys around, they tend to be a little bit more reticent. And I don't know, but I know I was shown some research studies, and that it's best for girls to have that freedom in their single-sex schools to grow up rather than having boys sort of affect them. That's the way it was put to me, and I had no reason to disbelieve it. So I would leave it to the experts. I think whatever is best.
Thank you. Ms. Hurt, be interested to hear your thoughts on this.
I think, one of the, from my understanding again, one of the reasons, we do have single-sex schools is that boys and girls learn quite differently. So, I think at least from what I've observed, my sons, they're quite physical learners and, they just can't sit still. Whereas I know it's a bit of a stereotype, but, girls, they don't require that much physical activity. So I think there are benefits to having, single-sex schools. However, I don't think this should be a barrier to, and I don't think this should be the reason why, that we end up with this inequality between the sexes. And we can easily address this by, like I mentioned earlier, we do actually bring in programs and, education for boys and girls about, what is right, what is respectful, between the sexes, how can a respectful relationship actually evolve. And I know now it's COVID times and, we don't really have inter-school activities. But I do actually feel that there's quite a lot of that can be learned, that can be students can benefit quite a lot from inter-school activities, especially between what is traditionally seen as desirable schools and maybe with more in neighborhood schools. I think there should be more activities between them, and that will have the added benefit of just exposing these students and to maybe lived experiences that are a bit different to their own, and that would actually also have a happy, side effect of helping expose them to different types of students based on, as opposed to just the classmates that they have.
Thank you. So, that particular question was trying to get at a sense of possible root causes of why there might be gender inequality. Another question that is directed at, sort of creating environments which are more gender blind, not even gender neutral, but gender blind. It reads as follows: do you think that it would be valuable for us to take traits such as marital status, race, gender off of job applications? So in other words, you sort of assess on the basis of the experience and what the individual is able to bring to it without knowing whether he or she is male, female, Chinese, Indian, etc. Ms. He, what are your thoughts around that?
I think it's quite interesting. I think I read a study the other day which showed that for musical auditions, when they actually have the screen between the interviewers and the people actually playing the instruments, they find that when they have the screen up and they don't actually know whether it's a man or a woman behind the screen, they find that actually women and the successful rates for men and women are more equal. But when the screen comes down, or if, let's say the musician behind the screen coughs or makes some indication that it's a man or a woman, they actually find that I think it's something really high, like 80 or 90% success rate goes to men, compared with 10-20% for women. So that's that sort of drastic, really, really drastic, difference between that. I suspect there's a little bit of that feeds into other areas of, when we're looking for job applicants. Practically, whether that's possible or not, ultimately, if you have an interview as part of a job, you will find out whether it's a woman or a man, or whether it's what race the person is. But I think one way we can actually get through the first hurdle is to, take away all that information from the CV. And I think countries like the UK, they do actually have a diversity survey right at the end of every job application, I believe. But this is actually removed from the actual application itself, and it's hidden from the first step of the screening. So I think this is something that we can actually really benefit from, as opposed to, when we receive CV, sometimes we got, a picture of the person, the applicant, and at the top of the CV. I think that's probably not very helpful, especially getting through that first hurdle of getting someone to interview.
Right. Thank you for that. But as you say, that is really just the first hurdle, because the multiple hurdles that could follow are perhaps even more difficult. And so perhaps what's really quite important is coming back to mindset changes, cultural changes, which can come through things like unconscious bias training and so forth. The question about sort of not having these indicators or these manifest in an application could go some way, but would not actually solve the issue as such.
No, I don't think, it's definitely not a silver bullet, but, by doing it as a first step, again, we're sending that signal we talked about earlier when we talk about legislation, that, we really need to start looking at each applicant based on their merits, at least in the first, and then we can control that at least in the first stage of things.
Certainly. Since we're talking about the workplace, might as well go to the boardroom. And there are a couple of questions with some upvoting on quotas. And it's not a new issue, and many people have talked about this before, with its pros and cons. But let's hear it from both of you, what your thoughts about quotas might be for the boardroom. Ms. He, you're lighted up, so I'll let you go first.
Okay,
on how we can improve the numbers on the boardroom representation?
Yes, by having a quota system.
Yeah. You see, I'm not a fan of quotas. I think, and people who get in on the basis of quotas are not going to feel that, they've been there entirely on merit. The reality is our women are high achievers, and they have done extremely well. If you look at some of the professions, law, medicine, accounting, banking, they do extremely well. In fact, I tell many people when I used to do interviews in my law firm, I had to do positive discrimination in favor of the boys, because the women come in, they're much better prepared, they interview much better than the boys do. But we need to push the companies to do better in terms of getting the women onto the boards. And the women need mentoring as well. And Council for Board Diversity does a great job on this. I've met them. In fact, I think now almost 9 years ago, I met them. And I spoke about this as well. MAS has a view on this, and MAS and Council for Board have been discussing. And I think some sort of framework that looks at it and as transparently says which companies are doing well and which companies aren't doing so well would help to push this along, rather than, I think, hard quotas. So CBD, for example, mentors women and prepares them. So when a company says, I need a person on the board, we need some women, there are women who have the relevant experience, expertise, who have been mentored and who are ready to be appointed. So they keep such a list. SGX talks to the companies. I think we can do a bit more, and that's one of those things that is being looked at as part of this white paper and discussions. When it may be able to come out with, and there is because you're dealing with listed companies, there is a fairly lengthy process of discussions that are going on within MAS on how we should structure it. But I think people who have studied it come back and say hard quotas may not be the best approach. But you may need something stronger than just moral suasion. Yeah.
Thank you. Ms. He, would you like to share your thoughts on this?
I mean, I'm also agree that, I don't think that quotas are the answer, especially not just for women, but other forms of diversity as well in terms of race. Otherwise you do end up in danger of really going down the path of tokenism, or just having these quotas filled for the sake of just having these quotas filled. But I think the minister did mention earlier about mentorships and having women role models and women examples of women then sort of talking to more junior women, mentoring them, just trying to share with them their experiences and how they've overcome some of the difficulties, because I think that a lot of shared experiences between women. I think we're moving in the correct direction. We're still nowhere near we need to be, and so I think quotas are definitely not something that that I feel is very helpful. And we really do just have to look at individuals based on talent, based on who they are, not on the color of their skin, not on their gender. And I think it's also really important for us, because obviously I'm here in my capacity as a representative of a political party. I think it's also really important that the Workers' Party, for example, we do genuinely just place people where we feel their strengths are and where they actually suit, where they actually suited. So we have an Indian SG, we have a female chair. Our unit team actually was 3 minorities out of 5. So I think when organizations and our leaders in business and politics, we start actually walking the talk that way, that will actually really drive businesses and listed companies towards having a more diverse representation on their boards in terms of their senior management. And then I think everyone really benefits, because the more diverse you are, the more experiences you actually bring to the table. And I think this will only strengthen the country, society, and businesses.
Thank you. Indeed, modeling the way is very important. I have a set of questions around the more marginal or marginalized women. There's a question around how we can support single mothers better. And there is a set of questions about our female domestic workers, our foreign domestic workers, who really sort of sacrifice their own lives and their own children and invest emotionally in ours. And what can we do more for both these groups of marginal women in society? Perhaps I could start with Ms. He.
I think, having had, a fantastic support network, family and also external support network, and also the support of my former boss, all I can say is I really don't know how single moms do it. It's, having kids and raising them and, wanting to do your best for them, constantly having this thought of what's my kid doing at the back of my head and all that, that sort of mum guilt, as they call it. I can just imagine it's so much worse for them. So I really do feel that we need to stop penalizing them, especially when the penalties are actually ultimately felt by the children, because these children, our children don't choose which families they're born in. So I think we really need to start looking into policies and laws that actually penalize such the children and such single moms as well. And in terms of foreign domestic workers, obviously I admit that I do benefit from having one at home. I do think that we as a society cannot always rely on the fact that there will be these women who are willing to come to our houses and do what is ultimately a very difficult job, giving up their children, and I don't think that that's actually a sustainable labor solution. So we really must start looking at the broader picture of how we can better support households, of mums, of care, of carers in general, so that women, as I said earlier, women then, or women and men really, then can find it easier to balance going out there, making money to make ends meet, and also their responsibilities in the household.
Thank you. Minister, would like to invite your thoughts.
Thank you. On single women, I agree with you, Prof, and the sentiments. I mean, if you look at single women, children, we want to make sure that they are taken care of and help the single woman take care of the children. So for those who need it, there's a social support program to take care of them. Then, of course, a very comprehensive education program that comes in a number of ways. One, through the social support program, but also through the schools, where it's not just single women, but anyone with a lower income, where the children are struggling or they have difficulties. Today, MOE does a lot to focus resources on these children because they are our resource, Singapore's only resource. We got to make sure that they achieve their full potential. It's the right thing to do, and it is the smart thing to do as well. So we need to focus on them, and we need to support, as I said, the social support network for the single woman or single parent families. It's not just restricted to single women. The program that MSF has, social support program, is for any single parents. When it comes to foreign domestic workers, I think it's extremely important. We saw some of these really unacceptable, horrible, heartbreaking cases where foreign domestic workers have been treated like slaves and have been brutalized, and people have been charged for murder. I think we ought to try and see what we can do to prevent it. We have a lot of framework. Doctors have to see them. They are told what their rights are when they come into Singapore. They are spoken with, but still you get some cases. And we have to try and see how we can better protect them. And I think the income they earn is something, they make a choice. They say, okay, I can earn so much in the country that I'm in. If I go to Singapore, this is what I get. So they understand that. They make an economic choice. We got to make sure that their personal liberty and freedom and safety is taken care of. Prof, I had a thought earlier on parental leave. I won't mention it now. If there is time later on, I will mention it.
Thank you for flagging that. I'll come back to it. Ms. He, your thoughts, any thoughts to add on this at this point?
No, I think, the minister covered quite a lot of, and I think we are in alignment with some of the points. And, I mentioned earlier as well, this is something that we need to work further on and really make sure that we protect both these vulnerable single moms and also the FDWs.
Thank you. Thank you. So this next question is not a new one, but it would be interesting to hear your thoughts. Could we look forward to the word gender being added to the national pledge?
Sure, why not?
It's a policy matter, and it's a matter that I would leave to cabinet.
Thank you. There is this question, surely I must invite the minister to respond to first, and then Ms. He. It says, how do we get men on board to jointly advocate for women equality, since it's been identified as a societal issue and not just a women's issue? So I'll ask the man who's leading the charge.
Sorry, Prof, your question didn't come through clearly. Can I trouble you to repeat it again?
Yeah, no problem. How do we get men on board to jointly advocate for women equality, since it's a societal issue, not a women's issue?
It's not a women's issue. It is a societal issue, and every man has a serious role. How do you get them to come on? If you have ideas, please tell us. Because in the conversations that we've been having, we have tried to get men on board. It's been encouraging, but I'll be frank, 75% were women, 25% were men. And we need to change that balance to 50-50. We need to get more men into it. What I can say is at the senior civil service levels, at the cabinet level, the men and women are all at item that this is an important issue. And what I believe is that based on the conversations that my fellow colleagues have been having in these conversations on women's development, a lot of men believe that. So is it half full or half empty? I think we can do more. But the good news is that a lot of men do believe it. And it's important.
Indeed, indeed. Ms. He?
I thought that was actually quite interesting that the male respondents were 25% and women was 75%. Probably worth looking into why that's the case. Whether it's because men feel that it's not important or it's not their role or not their place to speak out.
We can't force people to attend.
No, for sure. But, of course, I'm just wondering out loud why that's the case. Is it because of a lack of interest, or they feel that they feel awkward about it? Again, I really I think that's worth taking a look at. I think it's important to have men play their part in this conversation because we keep going back to the same theme about the way they actually support women, especially women who do want to climb the corporate ladder, but want to have children as well. So having men take part in the conversation is important. Having male voices in the conversation is something to be encouraged, and it's great that we do have men who are interested enough and who actually feel strongly enough about this, who are taking part in it. However, I think we just need to be conscious of the fact that we don't end up in a situation where the male voices or the male the traditionally male way of looking at things doesn't end up drowning out the voices of women out there. So I think it's just a balance that we have to be mindful of as we carry on the conversation. And I really hope that, after the white paper is out, after this year is over, we still continue the conversation, because I don't think the job will just end there.
Yes. Thank you for that. So there are some questions that come back to the workplace. So if you'll indulge me, I'm going to go back to the office. It says, how do we deal with employers who tell young women executives they are too young for a senior role, even when they have been performing that very senior role in all but name very satisfactorily? Ms. He, would you like to take that?
Honestly, I think age, gender, all of this, hopefully one day we will start just looking at, as I said earlier, looking at people from the based on the value that they actually bring to the table. I know that again, talking about personal experience, people do make comments that how do you get to that position at your age, or how do you get to that stage? And so that suggests to me there's still much work that needs to be done, that if we equate women or youth with being inferior in some way. But I think as we do have more, again, coming back to the same point about having more role models, having more positive examples, that's really going to go a really long way in normalizing things. And I think we are getting there. It's just that we just need more of it.
Thank you. So there's a question about media and its role in reinforcing gender stereotypes, and what we can do to change media depictions of women, but I would add of men too. Perhaps I could direct this question to Minister.
I would say this, Prof. and Ms. He. If you look at the Singapore workforce anyway, in say journalism and various other places, you actually get a large number of women in those sectors. They understand. These are all highly educated people, men and women, journalists, highly educated. They reported. We have to, one part of it is the mindset change that we spoke about earlier across. But I don't believe that these women who write articles have, need any mindset change. I think they understand the women's role. They understand that they realize that they are as good, if not better, and that, ability should be assessed not on the basis of gender, but what you produce. And my own sense is that in significant parts of our society, including the media, that is understood. That's why when I started out, what I said, I think I would say that glass is 2/3 full, but it's not fully full. There's more to go. Does that mean that we don't get objectification? You hear the phrase, if you project women in a certain way and you project men in a certain way, more copies of a newspaper or a magazine gets sold. I mean, these things happen, and it's going to be a whole of society effort to say, look, the government can put out a framework as what is pornography, what is not, but well short of that line, there are issues of standards and proper way of having a media discourse. And we should make sure that that comes through clearly. But I would say, by and large, our media, I don't think it has crosses many lines compared with, say, media elsewhere.
Thank you. Ms. He, your thoughts about media?
I think, I do agree with the minister that, our media is nowhere near the levels that you see in some countries where, it's really bordering on the unacceptable. However, one thing that I find quite interesting as, for example, during the 2015 campaign during the election, I'm just talking based on personal experience here of the media. What I found actually really quite interesting then was that because I was a single young female candidate, I did end up with a lot of questions being thrown at me by journalists about, my marital status, whether or not I was dating anybody, when was I going to have children, because, they looked at me and they saw this, young female person, and, the immediate thought there was, I'm going to, when am I going to go off and start a family? And interestingly enough, the Terence, who was on the same team, was also unmarried at the time, but he was getting questions about where do you see Singapore's economy going? So it's a bit more subtle in that. And then these are actually a lot of them were actually female journalists. So I think we need to be mindful that as women, sometimes we can be very harsh on women as well. So we need to be mindful of our own, our own attitudes, and just to think that, and not to assume that just because there are a lot of female journalists there, therefore there's not a problem, we should move on. So I think we just need to be more mindful of the fact that sometimes women can be another woman's harshest critic, and as long as we're aware of that, I think it's quite helpful.
Thank you. Let's see now. This is quite an open question, but an interesting one. There are many gender issues for state and society to address. In your opinions, what is the easiest to change and what is the hardest? Perhaps I could begin with Minister.
Okay. I mentioned some. I think the issues relating to sexual assaults, voyeurism, how do we treat that in the courts? What sort of laws do we need to put in place? How do we enhance the penalties? Those, as I said, are fairly straightforward. And I want to touch on the issues that have been central to the conversations, because rather than listing, these are easy and these aren't easy, I will take it with what has been important for the women and the men who spoke up on these issues. Workplace. We've dealt quite a bit on workplace, but essentially what are women asking for? They're asking for fairness. So when they go away on maternity and they come back, do they get back their job in the same way? Are their clients still there? What happens? Has somebody else grown into that role and is not quite willing to give it back? How does the environment, how do the employees treat it? Employers run a business. How do we, and not all of this can be done by law, how do we try and create a change in society where we have a legal framework and at the same time, there is also a cultural mindset. So the two come together to try and give women what we basically say is a fair treatment, right? That's one area. Harassment in the workplace. Again, a little bit easier to deal with. we, have, if you have a strict set of laws on what harassment amounts to, plus making sure that there is an ability to get recourse if there is harassment quite easily. And now the law has provided a very substantial amount of recourse and has made it easier with specialized courts as well. And I do take into account what Ms. He said, that a lot of it falls on the individual who has been harmed or feels that she or he, usually a she, has been harmed. Is a mindset, cultural change, organizational change. We need to encourage companies to put in place systems. For example, I know ministries, including my own ministry, by nature, if you take the police force or civil defense, it's a very male-centered organization, and there are some women. And it's very important that we handle any kind of harassment sensitively and properly and effectively. So there's got to be avenues for, and I checked this myself. I've asked for a report, I was given a report, I looked at it. What is the framework? How is the structure? There's got to be an ability to raise it to a superior without any sanctions being visited at a very high level. And any follow-up has to be done sensitively and taken seriously without the individual being targeted or in any way dealt with negatively, or assuming the complaint is merited. And there must be a follow-through. And if the harassment complaint is made out, there must be consequences. Now, in a place like police force, if there is a framework, that's easy to do. Outside, and it's not just the police force, the entire home team, and I know many other ministries follow similar processes. So the complaint goes direct to the very senior person in the ministry, usually a senior person in the HR, and they deal with it, bypassing the usual channels. And anonymity is given for the complainant until it becomes necessary to proceed further. Outside, it's of course in companies, there are big companies, there are small companies, there are different practices. It's not going to be easy to institute a single process for all, but I think we ought to try and again create a mindset change. So workplace, fairness, no discrimination, protection. Then if you go back to caregiving, it is both easy and not so easy, in the sense that you want to create a support system, a care network system, you want to put in the medical facilities. I think some of it is doable through policy initiatives. And some of it, which requires mindset changes, which requires greater participation of, say, men in giving care, it's going to take time in our society. Another aspect of it would be, we talked about finances. We all agree, there's got to be a recognition, a financial recognition. Is it easy to do? Is it not so easy to do? At one level, it's easy to do, in the sense that, you just decide how much and you try and put the money aside. At another level, it's affordability of the entire state and state's finances. How much can you afford? And those are serious questions. I mean, finances are not limitless. So how much can you afford? Those are hard questions too. And so you have various trade-offs. We have to look at those carefully and try and do the best we can. I'm just giving you 3 examples, but there are many others. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. May I turn to Ms. He, and as a reminder, what do you think is perhaps the easiest to effect and what might be the greatest challenge?
Sure. I think honestly, the easiest way to do it is to look at ourselves, right? So we need to read more, we need to learn more, we need to speak more to the women in our lives, our wives, our daughters, our colleagues. we really just need to talk to them, find out what their experiences are, what their challenges are, what their struggles are, to really understand, why, some of the issues that we've been discussing today, why are they such big issues and big problems and challenges for the women in our lives. And I think, just going to them and, just really understanding, putting ourselves in their shoes, putting ourselves in the shoes of women. I think that's something that's the easiest thing that each one of us can do. Find out what they need, find out what they want. And then everything else will flow from there, whether it's, legislation, whether it's policy changes, whether it's changes that you make as a business leader to your organization, or even to your own household, changes that you can make, maybe talk to your wife, find out, whether she's struggling, whether she needs help, what can you do to actually help her juggle at home, and, can you pick up the children? Just simple things like that. And I think that is a very, very good first step. And I really do hope that people do come across and, and do that.
Thank you. I think we've got about 10 minutes, and I'm going to turn to schools as a site of socialization. And there are a set of questions around whether or not schools are reinforcing stereotypes. We had something of a question about single-sex schools earlier, but there's a set of questions around sex education in schools, reinforcing stereotypes. What are your thoughts about this as a parent, Ms. He?
Well, I mean, my children are still young, so, I have all this to look forward to as they grow up. I think just staying involved and having both parents, we're lucky enough to have both parents involved, and, my husband is very involved in the discussions that we have with the children. Just, keeping the communication open with our kids, and, talking to them, and again, just keeping the communication open, finding out what their friends are saying, or not asking them to report on their friends, but, discuss some of the ideas and some of the topics of conversation that they have in school. I think this can be a very good first step and first way of catching, some of these more toxic attitudes that might, our children might be exposed to at school. And then, just not scolding them or telling them what they should believe, but, to have a proper, more grown up and mature conversation about it. I think this is the role that we parents can actually play in that.
Thank you. Perhaps one last question for the Minister before I attempt a summary of a very rich and diverse conversation, which is a task in itself, but I shall try. The question for Minister is, what then is the action plan for progress from this point on?
Right. Prof, in response to specific questions, will we be doing this or will we be doing that? I told you, look, I'm unable to commit for obvious reasons until, the government comes up and finalizes the policy. And many of these issues are still in discussion. There are serious trade-offs. What kind of trade-offs? I said, can I come back to the point on parental leave, for example? What are the trade-offs? If you looked at it as a discrete issue, it's a no-brainer. You must give parental leave for both parents, and you must mandate it and make it done. And there are countries which do it and do it successfully. But what are the trade-offs for us? Our economy is structured very differently. Base is small place. We depend on investments coming in. That's a little bit different from, say, Scandinavian countries or European countries with a much larger base and a different kind of economy. So for an investor, he's not concerned about your parental leave policies per se or your social policies. He is concerned with what is it going to cost me if I go to Singapore? Do I put it in Singapore or do I put it in a competitor country? And so there is an underlying economy which has to be attractive for investors, because our local economy is just not big enough. Our external economy is 3.5, 4 times the size of the internal economy. So you have to then ask, okay, if I impose this cost on the employer, will we still get the investments? And if we don't get the investments, who does it affect most? It affects everybody, men and women, and the economy, and ultimately the children as well. So these are the sort of trade-offs that policymakers have to deal with, because as discrete issues, each one is a no-brainer. But when you put it together, the total cost, the package, who is going to pay for it? How do we pay for it? Is it through a general policy of taxation? Is it through other ways? Or do we just pass it on to the employers? How do we do it? I mean, I just explained that to say what are the trade-offs that have to be thought through, not just financial, but also social policy trade-offs. But fundamentally, this is a very serious, very important cause, the equality of women. We cannot deviate from that. And I feel strongly about it. I feel passionately about it. My colleagues feel very strongly and passionately about it. And it is important that we set this direction. You asked what next. We have these conversations. In terms of a roadmap, it's the discussions, policy formulation, announcements, white paper, debate in Parliament, see how much of this we can put through. Now, what we can't do now, as Ms. He said earlier, you don't close the book and say we have done. This is, in some ways, a job that is never fully done. You keep plugging away. As a society, we have to have that approach, that we have to keep pushing on this. We have to keep plugging on it. Whatever we can do, we do now. What we can't do, we don't say that's the end of the story. What more needs to be done? And separately, mindset change, I said earlier, it's going to take a long time, and we have to start young. And MOE is already doing a fair bit of it. It will add on to that. So that's how I see the roadmap. This is an important cause. It's as much a cause for men as well as women. And we all have to be putting our shoulders to the wheel and pushing on this.
Thank you, Minister. Perhaps I could give Ms. He a chance for any final words that you'd like to share with the audience as well.
Sure. I do agree again that, of course, men and women do have to do their parts. However, I'm not so sure that it's equality versus financial cost. It's, from what I understand, diversity actually helps performance overall, and it helps everybody. It helps businesses, it helps families, it also helps men and women. So I think it's a bit of a false dichotomy here. But, coming back to actionable plans, I mentioned earlier, each one of us has, roles to play in finding out more about, the issues at hand, because, even my lived experience as a woman is not going to be same as, the woman next door. So I think, this is the role that we can play. And then we start talking about this, and we start having meaningful and constructive discussions at the policy level, at the legislative level, in Parliament, and amongst our constituents, amongst our families. And I think that's just how each one of us can really take charge of the situation. And I hope that women together with men can work together and really come together and just forge a path for women in Singapore and our place in the world as well.
Thank you. So thank you very much indeed, Minister Shanmugam and Ms. He. I think we've had a very stimulating, wide-ranging, diverse discussion centered very much on how we can better the lot for women in Singapore. I think we've covered lots of ground. We've talked about different social groups, even within the large monolith called women, because we've looked at, sort of single women, we've looked at foreign domestic workers, we've talked about minority groups within the broader swath of women as such, so different social groups, even within the group we call women. We've talked about different sites where gender experiences converge and collide. And that ranges from the boardroom to the workplace, to the media, whether traditional or social media. We've talked about schools. Interestingly, we didn't touch on NS, but that did emerge in an earlier session, so probably enough said there. So multiple sites where, gender relations are played out as such. We've talked about ways in which we might begin to change mindsets. And that ranges from the symbolic, changing the pledge, for example, a very powerful symbol, but a symbol nonetheless, to hard legislative change, as well as policy instruments that can be used. And those policy instruments, in some senses, the legislative changes they're not easy to effect, but they are concrete and specific, whether it's to do with sexual assault or exploitation, harassment, etc. Those are concrete, specific, and can be addressed and have been addressed. But the policy areas are broad and wide-ranging, from parental leave to care, recognizing care, invisible care, to supporting workforce re-entry programs, to strengthening childcare, elder care, etc. So there's a huge plethora of areas where policy can actually signal the seriousness with which we are approaching the challenges that Singapore society faces. And of course, it's not just Singapore society. I think finally, I would say that, beyond the symbolic, beyond the constitutional, legislative, policy changes, the marketplace has a role to play as well. Businesses have to take this seriously, and they don't have to always just follow legislation. If they believe in a cause, then I think, putting their monies where their mouths are equally important. And so the combination of government, of market, and of community, including community groups, I think is what is going to shift the needle. And that includes both men and women across these sectors of society as such. So I would like very much, in a normal setting, I would invite you to put your hands together to thank our two speakers, Minister Shanmugam and Ms. Herting Roo, who have spent an hour and a half with us sharing their thoughts and their hopes. But in the absence of applause, we'll do it in our own silent way at home. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Shanmugam, Ms. He, and Professor Kong for such a wide-ranging and provocative dialogue session. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now come to the end of the conference. I would like to extend my sincere thanks to all the speakers and moderators for an outstanding job sharing with us your knowledge, insights, and experiences on how Singapore can push the gender equality agenda forward. Thank you also to the audience for your active participation in the discussions. I hope that these are conversations we will all continue to have after today. While many important points were raised over the course of today's conference, there are three main takeaways from the discussions that stand out. First, while the share of women in the workforce has increased dramatically, women continue to face barriers in advancing in the workplace. This, in part, is because of the roles men and women traditionally play at home. Our panelists suggested more paternity-specific leave and increased diversity and inclusion work policies. But are these top-down approaches enough to change ingrained gendered norms? Second, caregivers are primarily women who play an important role in society in looking after our elderly and children. We need to recognize the value of this contribution. But what is the dollar value of caregiving? Is love and respect enough? Third, the digital world has created an even larger landscape for women to be harassed and violated. Legislations help, but we also need mindsets towards women and men to evolve. What needs to be done to drive such change? Whose responsibility is it to ensure that this change happens? Is it governments, organizations, or individuals? As we conclude our day, I'd like to thank our donors again for their generous support. Today's conference would not be possible without it. Special thanks also to the event's lead coordinator, Vani, Jasmine Ng, who's head of registration, and the rest of the IPS team for all your hard work in ensuring that this conference ran smoothly. This is despite having to pivot from a hybrid conference to a fully virtual one in less than 2 weeks. Much appreciation too to Liang Kai-sing and her public affairs team, as well as Lo Hansen and the IPS Corporate Associates team for your help in making this conference a success. Ladies and gentlemen, before you leave, please take a few minutes to complete the IPS feedback form. You may access the form by scanning the QR code shown on the screen. You can also find the link in the conference chat. Your comments will go a long way in helping us to improve future programs. Please be reminded that this dialogue session has been recorded and will be available to watch on the conference platform until the 9th of June. You will also be able to watch the recording on the IPS YouTube webpage after that. The speaker's presentation slides will also be available on the IPS events page next week. You can click on the link on the conference chat to access the page for more updates. Thank you very much again for joining us today, and have a good evening.